All right, I'm just going to go ahead and get us started. Eric and Kaylee, if you're ready, I'll go through my introductions and then I will turn it over to you. I just want to welcome everyone today. We've been really excited about this webinar for a while. 911 for families raising children with disabilities. We're going to talk about preparing for interactions with law enforcement and first responders today. Just a quick overview of who we are at Family Voices of Minnesota. For those of you who are not familiar, we are the state affiliate organization for Family Voices National and the state alliance member of Parent to Parent USA. So we provide, through our connected parent to parent peer support program, information, assistance to help families get needed services and supports. And that includes financial, healthcare, educational, and community life. We connect parents with other veteran volunteer parents who have a child with similar needs or experience. We offer one another emotional support, understanding, and acceptance. We all know this journey can be very isolating, but we don't have to feel alone. And then we offer encouragement and education to support parents in speaking up for their child. Just a few ways that we do this is through our one-to-one connections with another parent. That can be based around similar diagnosis or needs or upcoming procedures, things like that. And then we have parent groups for networking and emotional support and acceptance. A lot of those are virtual right now. And we have a resource-rich website where you can chat live with those of us who are behind the scenes, staff who are also parents. And we have educational webinars like this one. And then always family leadership and volunteer support parent training so all of us can grow as advocates. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Eric Ringgenberg, who is with the Autism Society of Minnesota. And our other presenter today is one of our parent support navigators here at Family Voices, who is also a parent, Kaylie Schmidt. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you also to Family Voices for including myself and the Autism Society of Minnesota in this session. I'll introduce myself a little further in just a moment, but to give you just a quick rundown of where we're heading with this session, after Kaylie and I do some brief presenter introductions, Kaylie's also going to share some personal stories of experiences that she has gone through as a parent with her family. Then we're going to talk about some topics related to disability and intersectionality to acknowledge that that is a very pertinent part of what often plays into the nature of some of these interactions. And then to close, we'll be working through a positive behavior support model of looking at how we can prevent certain situations from occurring in the first place or prepare for them if they do, how to teach new skills and build skills that are useful to facilitate communication, to stay safe in the community, etc. And then also some strategies for how to respond when different certain situations do occur. So we'll be within that third bullet point, looking at how to plan and practice, talking about some different systems of disclosure and what that means. I'll talk about just a handful of visual supports that can be useful to have these discussions and teach some of these skills, and then close by talking about some basic de-escalation strategies and a review of some general community resources that are available to make sure that you are aware of them. But as mentioned, I am currently the Education Program Director for the Autism Society of Minnesota. I do see quite a few familiar names joining us here, so thank you, friends of Awesome, as we fondly go by, who have joined. But if you haven't heard of our organization before, do know that the Autism Society of Minnesota is an affiliate of the Autism Society of America. It was started in 1971 by a group of parents and since has grown quite a bit. So the 5 main pillars of our mission are centered on advocacy, education, support, collaboration, and community building. And if you want to learn specifically about some of the events and programs and services we provide in the Twin Cities, but also throughout the state of Minnesota, I would encourage you to visit our website, ausm.org. Just a few other points about me personally. Before my current role here at the Autism Society, my background is primarily in special education. However, I've also worked as an in-home PCA. I've worked in a couple of different community-based settings, clinical settings, etc. My undergrad is from the University of Minnesota in child psychology, and I also have my master's in special education from the University of St. Thomas. And so I've primarily worked, I've worked with individuals of many ages. In school settings, I primarily worked with high school students navigating that transition to adulthood and out of the educational system. I also am a parent myself. I have two sons, one of which is finishing second grade today, the other of which is turning 4 at the end of July. So they do not have diagnosed or undiagnosed disabilities at this point that we are aware of. But as a parent, I think regardless of that status, there is a bond that we can leverage and that we can bring to the table. The last thing I'll say is another facet. I have many facets of my current role, but one of them that especially moving into the next couple of years will probably be occurring quite frequently is in training law enforcement officers, in training first responders. And so I'm thankful for the opportunities as well to get to engage around these topics with individuals, with families, because truly it's working on both sides of this dynamic that we can seek to address some of the issues that we experience. And so, as you might expect, my perspective, my experience, primarily centered in autism spectrum disorder. However, anything that I reference, I think very much is applicable on some level, if that is not the disability category that you or your individuals you support identify with. So with that, I'd love to allow and give Kaylie the chance to introduce herself and then segue into talking a little bit about some of the experiences that she has had with her son. So Kaylie, welcome.
Thank you. Yes, as Eric said, I'm Kaylie Schmidt. I am a parent support navigator with Family Voices, but as much as I love that job, my absolute favorite job is wife to Scott and mom to our 3 kiddos. And I'm excited to be here today to share some of our experience with crisis de-escalation and our experience with crisis, actually. And I do want to preface before I go into our story a little bit by just saying a little disclaimer that this is not a one-size-fits-all situation, and what the factors that go into my family's decision to call 911 or to utilize certain tools are going to look very different than another family's factors. And so I just want to be cognizant of the fact that this looks different for each family. And I'll share a little bit about some experiences that we've had, what went well, what didn't go well. And my hope is that anyone watching this, regardless of your factors, will be able to take something out of it that will be helpful in planning for your family. So Eric, if you want to go to the next slide, I think there's a picture of my little man there. So my middle son was diagnosed with autism about a year ago, and we love his amazing brain. We think he is just awesome. But we started noticing about a year ago when the world shut down that he was really struggling with an unknown problem. We couldn't really figure out the triggers for it. We couldn't figure out what we were dealing with. And then we got this, key to the puzzle a little bit of a diagnosis of autism. But what we noticed is regardless of what we were trying at home to help him manage his emotions, to help him feel better in his own skin, to deal with sensory components and all the things that go into his autism diagnosis, we were still seeing escalating behaviors. And what started as angry words and a little bit of difficulty with transitions and a lot of anxiety quickly transitioned to very violent physical attacks, property destruction, and eloping, all of which carry their own very unique factors to how we were going to keep him and the rest of our family members safe. And so as we were kind of researching and trying to find what are we going to do, I started to kind of formulate this plan in the back of my mind. What are we going to do on the day that we can't handle this on our own, when we need to call for help? What is that going to look like? Because on the front end, we were working on getting supports in place. We were working on getting him caregivers in place so that we could have, my husband and I could have a break. We were working on getting therapies set up that really respected him, but also gave him tools so that he could manage these big emotions and these big feelings and manage the world around him that was obviously a big trigger for him. And I started to just kind of tuck away things that I was researching late at night, as we all do when one of our kids is having a problem. We, researched looking for all sorts of things to do. And so I tucked away this kind of plan, but nothing was really working. And so I think anyone that deals with the world of disability knows that getting supports in place can be a painfully slow process. And so during the meantime, we were still seeing these behaviors escalate. And we started to see that we were maybe not going to be able to keep Logan safe. And so the first time that happened, we had gone to a friend's house for the day, and I was so proud of Logan. He had made it through the whole experience. He was really proud of himself. He was having a lot of fun. We had brought a PCA with us. We had a plan. We thought we had planned for every contingency. We gave him lots of transitions. We gave warnings that it was going to be time to transition soon. And when it was time to go, I looked at my husband and I said, okay, let's do this together. And he said, okay. And we walked towards him and we said, okay, it's time to go. And I saw it in his eyes right away. We weren't going to even get any time. That was the trigger. And he instantly flew into a rage like we had never seen before. And we attempted to do all the things that we know how to do. We talk in a calm voice with very little words when he gets to that point. We just keep everybody else safe. We move things out of his area. We do whatever we can to move things out of the way that would potentially be harmful to him in that situation so that he is safe. And it became clear about an hour into this encounter that he wasn't calming down. And my husband and I kept whispering to each other, like, is this the time? What do we do? I was covered in, injuries. He was obviously exhausted and didn't feel well in the situation. It was heartbreaking to listen to him say, I can't stop. I can't stop. And so after an hour and a half, because we were really wrestling, like, is this the time? What do? We did decide to call 911. And we dictated to our friends what needed to happen and what needed to be relayed to the dispatcher. And then the officer arrived about 15 to 20 minutes later. And we were really, really lucky in this situation that our county does have some training in autism spectrum disorder and how to work with these individuals. And so the officer that we got that time was wonderful and really helpful. Our son was violent towards him, and I was panicked during it because you just never know what's going to happen in that situation. I think something that we had in our favor was his size. He's only a little guy. And so I think for now, that works in our favor as a protective factor. But that scenario, we were able to de-escalate. He was able to come home with us, and we did our normal kind of routine that we do after a big meltdown to help him kind of recover and recoup. And then shortly thereafter, just a couple weeks later, I took my son to swim lessons. And one of the things that we had not prepared well for was what to do if we were out of the home. And he had a big episode because we had a really great plan at home when we have all the caregivers there, when we have all our resources available, but not such a great plan when we're out in the community for what we should do in that situation. And so it was time to leave swim lessons, which is a highly preferred activity for our son, and he was not ready to go. And I struggled to get him out of the pool because the pool staff couldn't be hands-on with him due to both COVID, but also just their policies on hands-on assistance with them. And so I was struggling to get him out of the pool. And then it quickly became clear that he was overpowering me as far as my ability to keep him and everyone else around me safe. So I did ask them to call 911. And I do want to say too that like a lot went into this. So like it seems as I'm sharing this story, like we really quickly went to calling 911, but there's a lot that went into that decision making, and there's a lot of factors that we were thinking about and considering when that happened. In this particular instance, I was more concerned about keeping my son safe near a pool by myself without any hands-on help. And so the police officer arrived. We were unable to de-escalate and did have to call for paramedics. We did find the paramedics to be rather unhelpful in that situation, and decided not to have him be transported by them. We were able, after a short period of time, to get him to calm down. But unfortunately, as a result of that encounter, I ended up needing medical care due to the injuries that I had sustained from just trying to keep him safe and out of the pool while he was upset. And then our final encounter, and this all happened within 1 month. Our final encounter was at home. His PCA was here and we were trying to help him calm down. He had been raging in his room, which is really a safe place for him to just kind of get out whatever feelings he needs to get out for quite some time. And we were becoming concerned that he was going to injure himself. And then he started verbalizing some concerning thoughts that made us feel like we did need to call for help. So we called for 911, and this time 2 officers, myself, my husband, and his PCA were unable to keep him calm and safe, and we did have to call for paramedics. The paramedics came. They attempted to sedate him, which failed, and he was taken by ambulance to the hospital, where we spent the evening doing kind of a psych eval and making a plan for him. So he ended up, as a result of that, in a partial hospitalization program, which has been tremendous and really helped him gain the tools that he needed to gain. But I think the thing in all of these that I have learned, some of the things that went really well for us is dictating important facts to the dispatcher. In talking with the officers that we talked with after our son was calm, that all that information is relayed to the officers. And I found that really helpful. So the things that we shared is like, we only want help with de-escalation. Our son is autistic. He is violent right now, but the caregivers are taking the main role in helping restrain him, that he would not listen to commands or authority, that we don't want him arrested, and that he did not have any weapons. I felt like that kind of laid a firm foundation for us to work on when the officer arrived, because they were already aware of several factors that is really important for them to know that they're safe walking into the situation, and that what our goal is with having them involved. We also had one of us meet the officer at the door and explain the situation, share things that were helpful, share some of our son's favorite things, his current favorite things that he likes to talk about, to give them some common ground to talk on. And then we allowed one person to be the point person, and then trade it off as needed. It's exhausting and highly emotionally charged when you're in this situation. And it was really helpful for my husband and I to kind of trade off so that we could get a break, take a breath, cry a little over what was going on, and then come back in and assist our son the best that we can. So he always had one person there with him who was ready and engaged and able to kind of help him talk through, you're okay, you're safe, we love you, we're right here with you, we're going to just sit here until you're okay. Keeping emotions in check until the right time. Obviously, this is within reason. We can't always control our emotions all the way, but we did really try to have, by trading off, have the parent that was feeling more calm at the moment to sit with him so that there was less emotion being added to an already emotionally charged situation. The other huge thing that has been really helpful is having we call it a bug out plan for our other kids that are in the home. It's really traumatic for both our son and our other kids to see what's going on when this is happening. So we have a plan that includes people that we can call and a bag that's already packed so that our other children can leave the home in this situation. So our focus can be solely on our son who is having a crisis, and our other kiddos are safe and taken care of. The other thing is a crisis plan for our PCA staff. I think that something we kind of missed was making sure that our support staff was really well versed on what we would like them to do, what we would like their role to be. So during the moment, we had to kind of bark out orders to whoever was around to help us. And I think in the future, we will have a really straightforward plan. This is your job. This is what you do in this situation. Some things that didn't go well, like I had said before, we didn't plan for a plan outside of the house. I think it's really easy. I'm a big planner, very type A, and I like to have a plan for every contingency, but I kind of missed the contingency of what if we're not here? What if we don't have the resources that we're comfortable with our everyday, day-to-day home environment? What do we do when we're at the pool? What do we do if we're in the middle of a park? What if we're in a parking lot? What is that going to look like? And how can we help support our son in that situation? We also made the mistake of not having an extra caregiver with him while he's really prone to some violent outbursts. We would plan to have more support staff around in the future. We also didn't have a plan for sedation. This was really important because we found that the meds did not work when the ambulance came, and we had no idea what to suggest or what to consent to. We just said, okay, let's try it. I don't know what to do. And it didn't go well. So one of the things we have put in place is we've talked with his providers, and we have a little cheat sheet of what we would like the ambulance to do should it come to that in the future. We also found that when the paramedics came, they kind of took over calling the shots, including asking me to leave the room. And I think the intention was good in the sense of like, they thought maybe I would become too emotional or that I might distract him or something. But I think in the future, I would have a little bit more firm plan of like, this is my home. I'm asking you in here to help us. And this is what we would like done. And I wouldn't leave my son's side. And then obviously miscommunication on what to do when it's hard to communicate in a crisis. So we like to try to plan on the front end as much as we can to prevent from that miscommunication happening in the middle of the moment. And then also planning with our other children. That bug out plan was developed in a crisis. And I wish that we had planned for that on the front end, so they knew what to do in that situation and they knew what was coming. Now they do, and I think, we don't know what we don't know, but these are all things that I think would be really helpful as you're planning for, okay, what happens in our worst case scenario? Obviously, this is not an everyday situation. We hope that we never have to call 911 again. But if we do, I feel like we are better and best prepared based on our experiences that we've had on what to do in the future should this situation arise again. So that's kind of our story and what we have experienced in a nutshell. These are only just a few examples of obviously lots of things that happened between him becoming a little bit more violent to all the way to needing to call 911, and I'd be happy to answer any questions at the end. So please feel free to add those to the chat if you have anything for me. And then I'd be happy to pass it back to Eric as we kind of go through some more of that planning on the front end.
Thank you, Kaylie. Thank you for sharing some of your family's experiences and things that you referenced, especially as you are seeking to move forward from some of the things that have happened, are definitely aligned with some of the things that we will talk about here. Before we do get into any of these specific strategies and support tools, as I mentioned, I do want to take a few minutes to acknowledge the fact that, especially in the context of disability, we need to ensure that we are also keeping that perspective of intersectional identities, because as you mentioned already, Kaylie, your experience is by no means invalid, but it is probably very different from the experience that others have had in multiple ways. And so let's acknowledge that disability is something that is found and impacts all communities. And so this is important, no matter who you are, where you live, to take some of the steps that we are going to talk about. However, let's not kid ourselves. The identities that you have, especially as we layer marginalized identities, does impact the access to diagnostic services, to different support services, and these things can differ widely across different demographics and identities. And so for a few examples, and this is not an exhaustive list nor meant to be in any sort of ranked order, but I think we all acknowledge that the color of your skin, your race, your ethnicity has a big part to do with the outcomes that are experienced, especially when we think about interacting with law enforcement. Same goes for your socioeconomic status, the wealth, the income, the social capital that you have to work with. When you have a lot of access to those forms of support and resources, it can be much easier to address things that are experienced. We also can say similar things for identities related to sexuality and or gender. And my intent is not to conflate the two, but to acknowledge that also is a very relevant source of some of the differences that can often go into these situations. Geography, where you live, especially if you live in more rural areas, the amount of access to different support services decreases significantly. The image that you see here is from a study done within the last 5 years or so, and they were actually looking at where those different diagnostic resources specific to autism can be found. And it's kind of shocking that the result was only about 16% of US counties have at least one or more resource for receiving a formal diagnosis, which many of you know is the gatekeeper to accessing really any sort of formalized support. And so even within those counties where it is found, not only are they supporting individuals that live within those boundaries, but often individuals from those more outlying areas are coming in seeking them as well. And another thing that's, I think, especially relevant when we consider this topic of discussion is age. Kaylie, I know that as your son ages, you have concerns that if these challenges were to continue, they may be addressed or responded to differently, especially if you seek the assistance of first responders. And so there's other things that can play into that as well from within this category. But let's acknowledge that who you are, and that is a very multi-layered, multifaceted question or answer, definitely impacts the access to resources that you have, as well as potentially the outcomes that are experienced even in similar situations. And there's many ways we could demonstrate that, but to give you at least one bit of kind of tangible example, I mentioned layering of those marginalized identities, and unfortunately, what often accompanies marginalized identities is different forms of stigma. And as those identities layer, we actually see more of a multiplicative instead of additive response. As different stigmas are layered on top of each other, this also has an intersecting impact, which can impact health, both physically, behaviorally, mentally, etc. And so the graph you see here in reference to this study that was done, this is not autism specific, but what they did is they looked across almost 2 decades of data looking at arrest rates or interactions of that nature among individuals who identify as white, Black, and Hispanic. Those are the 3 different line types. But then the A and B is either people without or with disabilities. And so this was looking at data between 1997 and 2014. And as you can clearly see, even if it's in a small window on your screen, there is significant disproportionality, especially as we look at non-white individuals. The other thing I'll point out is how we just mentioned age. We see that as individuals enter adolescence into young adulthood, not only is there an increase, but as I just mentioned, that increase is significantly disproportionate when we layer in those identities related to race. Other considerations before we move into specific strategies and supports is to know that both law enforcement, EMS, any sort of first responder as a public service does fall under Title II of the ADA. So at least on paper, in a technical sense, they are bound by the necessity to meet those requirements. My opinion is that that is much more a statement on paper than anything in actuality. And this is actually more of a law review that I've looked at recently, looking at that intersection of ADA and police, and especially specific to autism. And to offer this quote as a bit of a summary, this author says that dealing with this specific disability, or I would even say we could consider others as well, and it would be applicable, at the moment of that police encounter is simply too late. If police conduct is excused because of exigent circumstances, if officers can simply assert they were not aware of a disability status, then some of the protections that Title II is supposed to provide are essentially eliminated. And this is what is leading to this very self-fulfilling cyclical problem. And I want to say, I don't think that the author's intent is to say this will fix it. Their intent is to say, right now, nothing is being done. Can we at least try to start doing something in order to improve this? And so one idea that this author posits is that training that occurs prior to, once again, is not the panacea. It's not going to fix all of the issues, but that is one way to even have any semblance of not just saying we are completely disregarding this sort of requirement that we should be fulfilling. So from that, let's now think about what can we do? And Kaylie, thank you for highlighting the necessity and the need of that proactive planning that occurs prior to these situations. You also pointed out how even with the best and most thorough planning, it is likely that something will arise that you didn't consider, that doesn't work as well as it you intended, or it did when you practice it, outside of that context. So that's not going to ever fix everything, but it is important. But this is kind of a cyclical process in and of itself of let's plan, let's prepare, let's respond, and then let's debrief and go back to it. This is kind of a process that never, I think, is there actually a finish line or a finished product. But we'll think about first steps that we can take to seek to prevent these situations from occurring in the first place, because Unfortunately, there are many examples of these encounters going negatively and not as we envisioned. If we can prevent them occurring from the get-go, we reduce the likelihood of those negative experiences. We also want to always focus not only on prevention, but on how to teach and build skills once again, so that hopefully we can get to the point where more of that kind of de-escalation and more response-driven strategies won't be as needed or will be no longer needed, because we have new skills that allow someone to navigate these situations safely in a conducive manner. But as I just mentioned too, we also still do need to think about how we can respond and how we can support, Kaylie, as you mentioned, yourself as a parent, siblings and others who may be in the home, and especially the individual that is in distress in a person-centered sort of manner. There's a number of different resources that are linked to at the end that we'll be looking at, one of which that I'll reference here too, that kind of supports some of these statements I just said. The National Autism Indicators Report. These are products that come out of Drexel University, and they put out some great publications over the last decade here that really look at, for individuals, for families, for children, for adults, all around autism, kind of where are we at now? What are the issues? What are the needs? I've found them to be very useful for getting your head around a variety of different topics. And so there's others to look at as well if you are interested in going into those sort of resources. Thank you. But this one was centered around families, access to support services, and this one was primarily focused on adults with autism and the nature of their experiences. So as you see here on the right-hand side, one of the topics that did address that's very relevant to our discussion here is taking the data they had to work with and showing that we're at about 60% based on that of families with adults doing that sort of emergency planning at their service planning meetings. And so good to know that at least from this data set, it is a majority, but it also shows there's still plenty of room for this to occur, and it isn't necessarily occurring across the board. A couple of other bullet points that I pulled out that are applicable, but there's much other information as well. This report, once again, confirmed what we know, that families are the main providers of support for their autistic family members, or we could also generalize a bit to say family members with disabilities. And yet their role is often not recognized or supported as it should be. Also, families of color, those of low incomes, as I just alluded to a few slides ago, face additional adversity, stigma, difficulty, and stressors when trying to access different services, supports, locate quality of care related to things like emergency planning, but other things as well. Something I want to introduce here as we also start to get into some of these strategies is what we refer to as the anxiety curve. So you may have seen something similar to this before. This is a human universal. This is not anything specific to a disability status. That idea of we all have a relative baseline where we are calm, cool, and collected to the extent that we as an individual can be. We also become escalated at times, and we may do or say things we normally wouldn't do. We also have this peak level of anxiety that sometimes is referred to as sensory overwhelm, meltdown, breakdown. I mean, there's different ways of conveying it, but once again, I'm sure that all of us here at one time or another have reached that point where we do lose that ability to control our actions or our words. We're operating off of that brain stem and the instinctual fight or flight sort of responses that are meant to keep us alive, rather than that frontal lobe of our brain where our executive functioning is primarily found. And so we have to consider that if we are planning for the situations, the contexts that are likely going to be in that yellow up to that red mark, we are not going to be operating at our best as a parent, as a support provider, as an individual. There are probably reductions in things like communication, emotional regulation, etc., that we need to account for, that even if we are supporting or accommodating those things at that baseline level, let's be sure that we are providing that support that's needed to address the point that we probably are not going to be working from our maximum reservoir, so to speak, of our different skills and abilities. The other thing that Kaylie pointed out is what's meant to be illustrated by this other smaller kind of just rather than a hill or a curve, more of this mound here. That's the person supporting the distressed individual. And as Kaylie mentioned, that person needs to try to stay as calm, cool, collected, rationally detached emotionally as possible to provide the best support that we can. As Kaylie also mentioned, that is much easier said than done. And as that is not something that even the most skilled individuals can do indefinitely. So very much I want to assert that it is a sign of self-awareness, professionalism, respect to the individual, that if you find yourself getting into that yellow, that red sort of zone, that is what you need to do. You need to tap out with your significant other, with a colleague, with a service provider, etc. Because if you are escalated yourself, if you are taking things personally, you aren't going to be able to do what's needed to most effectively support the individual you are supporting. I think it is fair to also point that out if you notice that in a first responder. However, obviously, it is up to them to take that feedback and use it. We can't require or mandate that upon pointing that out, they will actually follow through. Thankfully, I did see on the news last night, the St. Paul Police Department just went through a training that allows them to do that to their colleagues, basically to tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, I think you need to step out. I think you need to tag out. So that is a small step towards, hopefully on a wider scale, getting to the point where it is acknowledged and even expected that not only like a teacher or a parent or someone else that is obligated to do those sort of things, we also can be holding our first responders accountable for doing that as well. With that, especially as we do move into that yellow and red zone and maybe are experiencing that sense of overwhelm or meltdown, I want to introduce what we refer to as the iceberg metaphor of distressed behavior. I used to use the term challenging behavior up until very recently, but there's a link at the end that I will share and very much recommend that has kind of swayed me from that opinion. And to give a quote from there, they say, challenging behavior is a caregiver complaint, a complaint for someone who's supporting someone else. So the behavior in and of itself and the individual isn't challenged, they are distressed. And when, like all of us, when we are distressed, we may do or say things that can be observed by others that we normally wouldn't do. Sometimes that is demonstrated through refusal sorts of behaviors. It could be yelling, making threats, becoming aggressive or self-injurious, as well as some of those more internalizing responses, shutting down, eloping, or fleeing from the situation. These are all different sorts of fight or flight responses. But like an iceberg, that is what we can see, that's what we can observe, that's what unfortunately often leads to some of the stigma we referenced. However, these are being driven by things that are invisible, that lie under the surface, that we need to address in order to actually address the behavior we are seeing. So it's not those issues, those behaviors that are the issue, it's these underlying needs that aren't being addressed. Often those are related to physical health. That oftentimes when someone is in distress, a medical cause is one of the things that should almost be considered first before other things. It's also important to remember that behavior is a form of communication. And so what is that behavior trying to tell us, and how can we use that information to appropriately address and support the need, which makes the behavior no longer needed, relevant, etc. And so what that underlying needs for support may be is going to vary across individuals, across different disability categories, but that is where we need to spend our focus and our resources in order to address these behaviors in the long term. And it's beyond the scope of this session in particular to really go through this, but do know that there are options out there to think about where are we now, and from a person-centered, family-centered standpoint, as I'm talking through here today, how can we align positive behavior support that supports someone's need, but in a way that respects their preferences, their beliefs, etc. And so do know that as we move through this session and into the future, there are other things you can seek out, resources, training, etc., in order to reach some of the goals that we have been referencing. We are centering a lot of our discussion in that context of direct engagement with first responders, law enforcement officers, often when we are in that state of meltdown, overwhelm, etc. And Kaylie shared some examples to illustrate what that can look like, but there's many other examples as well. In addition to that, another focus of this session, another thing that's important for that same mindset of planning, preparation, having a plan of response, is also for other sorts of emergencies. That includes both natural disasters, things like tornadoes, floods, winter storms, severe weather, other forms of emergencies, fire, power outage, experience an illness or injury of an individual or a caregiver, things like a car accident. This is once again not an exhaustive list, but just like anyone can benefit from prior planning and preparation for these sorts of things, especially for families of individuals with disabilities. This is a very important step in being able to fall back on this when these things do occur. And so some of this information that I'm going to run through in the next handful of slides comes from the resource that's pictured here. This is a resource or publication that's linked at the end from the Minnesota State Council on Disability. But to take some initial steps in that sort of planning and preparation, we're often going to have plans that fall into these two main categories. We're planning for different types of emergencies where you either need to go, you need to leave immediately and evacuate, or you need to stay, you need to shelter in place where you are at, and you aren't able to go out or leave until the nature of the situation has resolved itself. This is important to think about for individuals and families at home, but also anywhere that you would spend a significant amount of time. So that could potentially be work, school, a house of worship, a family or friend's house. It's going to depend on your specific situation, but think about the most likely place to be where this may occur. And as already mentioned, individuals with specific and or severe needs often are the ones who can benefit the most from this proactive planning and ensure that especially if external support is needed, meaning that there's other individuals that have to be involved in supporting this person, that we ensure that occurs when or if these things were to happen. For those go plans where you have to evacuate, and that may occur, like we just said, across different locations. 4 elements to consider. How will you know what the emergency is, and how will you be notified? Obviously, there's things like fire alarms, smoke detectors, the severe weather sirens, but there may be other ways or other things to consider as well. But how am I going to find out? How will I make sure that I do find out if this occurs? The next step is wayfinding, as it's referred to. Where is the way out? How do I get out? Usually, especially for things like fire, we want to have a main method or point of egress, as well as a backup or secondary way out as well. We have located that. Next, how do we make sure that we can get out by yourself, or like I just mentioned, is there a need for assistance, especially from a mobility standpoint, to be able to evacuate? And in general, is there any other assistance that's needed? Let's put together a plan, as Kaylie mentioned, make sure everyone involved is aware, is accountable, understands what to do in these sorts of situations. Some other general basic tips for different forms of emergency planning. Communication is key. So communicate with others. That may be family members, friends, coworkers, neighbors, whoever may be involved in the plan or as a potential backup to the plan. Make sure they are aware, make sure you are in communication, and keep them up to date, especially if changes are made. Planning and practice. Things like how to escape from your home in an emergency, how to use potentially certain equipment. As we all know, for other sorts of skills usually explaining, talking it through isn't enough to verify, do they actually have the skills to use it when the time comes? Let's practice, let's model, let's give feedback, let's go about that process of skill building that we do for other social, emotional, adaptive behaviors. This falls just as well into those categories. Potentially keeping a go bag with different emergency supplies so that in the moment you're not trying to scramble to put those things together. I by no means am encouraging you to become some form of prepper and go above and beyond just basic steps. I also know that there is an amount of privilege that goes along with being able to have a stockpile of different forms of supplies, especially things like medication or other things that may be expensive or difficult to access. And as we shortly here get into talking about systems of disclosure, especially as individuals such as Kaylie's son age and become adolescents, adults, it's important to practice with them telling people about your needs and how to support you, whether that is sharing a specific disability label, whether that is specifying more of a specific skill or method of support, but we need to be building those skills in allowing individuals to the greatest extent possible to be able to advocate, to be able to disclose these things that are needed in order to keep them safe, in order to keep them from being victimized by others. Some general thoughts as far as things that are useful to have on hand, both at home or compiled so that you're able to grab them on the fly as needed. Obviously, having smoke and carbon monoxide detectors in your home, a working fire extinguisher, basic first aid supplies, or if someone does have a more specialized or medically complex condition, let's make sure that those things are available, and as able, we maybe have a few extra on hand. Flashlight and batteries or candles, matches, lighter, some form of weather radio that's either battery, solar, or crank operated. And as I just mentioned, as you are able to a reasonable degree, a small supply of food, water, medication, preferred fidgets, coping mechanisms, visuals, communication tools. It's going to depend on your specific scenario, what it is that is pertinent to make sure you have available in some sort of emergency. The other thing is, don't forget about your non-human family members as well, and their needs should some of those things arise. Kaylie, before we get into systems of disclosure, is there anything that you would want to add or that you have learned when it comes to preparing for some of those other potentially unexpected emergency situations that don't fall kind of under that category of kind of being in that state of meltdown or overwhelm?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is for our son, home is his safe place. And in a panicky moment, he's not going to leave willingly or calmly. And so one of the biggest planning things that we've had to do is how would we get him out? How would we make sure that somebody would know how to communicate with him in a way that would get him out of the home should that be necessary? So a lot of, our safety planning for like a tornado looks fine because we go down to the basement and we, all hunker down in his safe space. But what does that look like if a firefighter is the one that's talking to him because mom and dad are not able to, or if it's a police officer talking to him, or if he needs to leave the home. So there's been a lot of planning around that, but I would encourage caregivers to think through that scenario. If it's not you being the one to communicate with your child, how will you ensure that they can communicate well with your child? So that's just one thing that's kind of come to mind as we were thinking of this.
Sure. And it sounds like the go plans versus the stay plans might be a bit more of a challenge for your son and your family should they arise. So thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Next, we're going to talk through a few different systems of disclosure. First, we will share what we mean and some considerations that are important when we approach this topic. But then also I'll be sharing a couple of specific types or forms of disclosure that especially are relevant potentially for some, but not all individuals within the scope of different emergency scenarios. But that term disclosure, what we mean here is sharing personal information. And here this is about a disability status, but you could disclose other facts about yourself as well with someone for the purpose of receiving some sort of accommodation, support, or understanding. There are a few different types of disclosure we can consider. There are formal types of disclosure that especially in things like employment or post-secondary learning, in order to access any sort of formalized accommodation, you often have to formally disclose. There's some paperwork involved, might be with human resources or the office supporting students with disabilities. But that's what we're referring to when we say formal disclosure. There's a bit of a legality to it in some way, shape, or form. Here, I think, is where we're really looking at more informal or soft forms of disclosure. Although, if you do choose to opt into some of these systems that I will reference, that I guess that is a little bit more formalized in a sense. But we'll talk a little bit about how different forms of informal disclosure can be worded or communicated on the next slide. Also, a very relevant, valid choice of disclosure is non-disclosure. This is personal information. And so I personally believe that it's inappropriate to set up systems that are mandatory, that don't allow people to choose to opt in to have this sort of information available about themselves. It can be very useful to certain individuals and situations, but I very much think, especially in this conversation we're having, Non-disclosure is important to promote as a very valid option because it may be what is most appropriate for certain individuals, families, or situations. So as I just mentioned, this is a personal decision, whether to share, when to share, what to share. That all depends on the situation, your preferences and comfort, etc. If we do choose to disclose, either formally, informally, kind of soft or hard disclosure, sometimes that can be a label or a disability category. When it comes to autism, that often doesn't actually give a whole lot of useful information to the individual. Whereas, because, and what I mean by that is because autism is such a varied heterogeneous condition, just saying you are autistic does not necessarily specify where you need support, where your challenges may lie. For other conditions, such as epilepsy or seizures, allergies, etc., using the label can be very useful. And so this, as we already mentioned, this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. What works best for you is what you should go with. But a label, whether that's specific or just in general, saying I have a disability, I am a person with a disability, however you choose to word that, that is one option. You also can focus on the need. And as I already said, I think if you go with the label, especially for autism, you also need to get more specific on what is that specific need for accommodation or support that you personally or your loved one needs. So it may be that you have trouble focusing or attending or hearing someone in a very noisy, chaotic environment. Can we move somewhere quieter so that I'm able to focus and actually understand what it is you're trying to communicate to me? Saying I may need to move my body in order to stay in or regain control. I may need to stim. You are asking me right now not to pace, not to flap, whatever that is. I need to move my body that is advantageous to the situation at hand. And once again, these are just examples, but please take this and think about for yourself, for your loved one, what it is that you would be willing to share and what would be most applicable to share if needed. Taking that a step further, let's look at a couple of different specific options or systems that may or may not be appropriate or more or less applicable to your given situation. One of which is a medical alert. I would recommend either a bracelet or necklace because those are the two areas that first responders are trained to look for these sort of things. And this all comes directly from their website. This isn't meant to be a sales pitch, but I just wanted you to hear directly what it is that these different organizations, manufacturers, etc., intend these to do. This can help to prevent misdiagnosis, unwanted drug interactions, or treatments that may pose a risk to a patient's medical condition. I mentioned how often trained to look around the neck or wrist. Also, there is the potential, if you do have access to a health insurance plan, they may be able to reimburse you for the purchase of this. And so these are often much more useful when an individual may have significant communication challenges. They may have a condition that could render them incapacitated. It's up to you to decide what is needed and what is the best fit. Other option is a wallet card of some sort of type. There's multiple types out there. I share this link because this is an organization where you could be able to get one shipped to you for free. This is the sort of thing where you would list different pertinent emergency contact information, allergies, etc. It's a way to personalize information so that it is able to be shared. It will have everything that's needed there. It's a communication tool. At the Autism Society of Minnesota, we don't have a system to offer these personalized forms of wallet card, but what we do often provide are these kind of business card rather size cards that on one side say, what is autism? On the other side, it says either I have autism or this child has autism. And so we know that especially in times of distress, autistic individuals who may at other times be able to communicate verbally may experience periods of being nonverbal. So having something like this to communicate in a somewhat thought out manner what you would want to share can be very useful. Let's also say Kaylee's with her son out in public. There's a bystander who maybe is trying to be a bit helpful, but is probably doing a little bit more harm than good. It gives you something that you could just hand to them to share that doesn't require you to off the cuff to have to share that information verbally yourself. And once again, to reiterate very clearly, these are not intended to say these are things you should do. These are meant to provide you with options that you yourself can view your particular situation and decide what is applicable, what do I feel is I'm willing to share, like I said, what is safe for me and my family. And as we pointed out at the beginning, that can vary very widely and significantly across different intersectional identities. Another system that is found here, it has spread to a few other locales outside of the state of Minnesota, but it was developed and it originated here primarily within the Twin Cities metro area, but has since expanded a bit as well. That is the Vitals app. So this is referred to as the only digital medical ID. So it takes that topic of medical ID disclosure and leverages it with advancements in technology. As they state on their website, they feel that this can reduce the risk of misunderstandings during both medical or behavioral/mental health emergencies. The Profile app, it gives you the ability to share upon your choosing as you feel comfortable, critical information such as disability categories or diagnoses and conditions, allergies, potential triggers, de-escalation techniques, potentially what medications are being administered, emergency contact info. You can actually upload videos. And so if you want to see some example videos on their website, there's one where there's a mom who's uploaded a video of her saying, hey, you're okay. The people with you will keep you safe. I will be there as soon as I can. So that would actually trigger, you could use that video rather if this was set up. To elaborate a little bit further on how this system works, as I mentioned, you have to opt in. It is voluntary, but when there is a department or municipality that also has registered and is using it, on the next page here, we have a couple of different options for these transponders. You can wear that, you wear them on your person, and when that transponder gets within 80 feet, yes, it's either feet or yards, might be yards, feet or yards of someone with the app on their end, it dings and this profile pops up, as you see here in the example, which was the best for giving the kind of whole screen screenshot of the app. Other things like Alzheimer's, dementia, allergies, epilepsy, in addition to things potentially like autism, PTSD, but not a perfect fit for anyone by any means. The other system of disclosure to reference is Project Lifesaver. This uses radio technology and specially trained search and rescue teams for those that may have a tendency to wander, elope, get lost, and not be able to safely return or ask for assistance in order to do so. So somewhat similarly to the Vitals, you wear a small transponder that has an individualized frequency signal. If someone enrolled goes missing, a trained team is sent out to respond. They use a device to try to track that frequency and locate the individual. This is what those transponders look like. And here is a snapshot of all of the general areas in Minnesota and the surrounding states where this is being implemented. Getting now into thinking about some of those different teaching strategies. And once again, this is by no means exhaustive, but I want to share a few things that I think I have found to be useful and that I think are especially pertinent to some of these topics. In general, when we're seeking to communicate, especially with individuals that may have communication differences, let's strive to use language that is a bit more simple, clear, literal, and I'd also add positive, meaning focusing on just as much or more on what to do, not only what not to do. We always want to allow for that additional processing time, whether that is in our interpersonal back and forth conversation or to take in this information, let it sit, review from time to time. Let's accommodate those that may have differences in that sort of processing of information. It's usually beneficial to break different directives down into specific steps, especially if we are wanting someone to follow a certain set of steps in a certain high stress, high stakes sort of situation. The ability to offer choices not only centers ourselves in a person's preferences and needs, but also can be de-escalatory, especially in those low levels of agitation. Rather than me digging in my heels as someone may be becoming a bit escalated or more rigid, by offering someone different choices to pick from, we can try to work through that scenario, but not in a way that we are just trying to one up another. And we are more trying to work together than to seek just compliance for compliance sake. And especially in times of stress, if not at all times, using different written or visual forms of communication often is much better than solely verbal communication. We always want to pair our verbal teaching with some sort of visual reference. What could that mean then? Here is a tool that's been put together by the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research at Temple University. There's actually a backside as well that has a bit of that wallet card idea of kind of emergency contact, things of that nature. But as you see, they have developed this low-tech assistive technology tool that, especially in the context of these emergency situation, allows us to either seek information or allow someone to express themselves in a way to communicate what is going on. And so there's a link at the end if you'd like to download the PDF yourself, but I want to make sure you're aware of this tool that is available. Another thing that is used at different times to teach things like emotional awareness, emotional regulation, self-regulation is the incredible 5-point scale. This is the work of Carrie Dunbaron and Mitzi Curtis. I'm sure some of you have seen it before, but if not, the method or the mentality behind this is well aligned with that anxiety curve we looked like, that idea that we all have different states of regulation or escalation. The goal is to be able to the greatest extent possible, try to self-identify those things, but also with support, we want to be able to understand at these different levels, what does it look like? What does it feel like? And probably just as important or more important, what strategies do we use there? And the goal is to try to catch and mitigate these things at lower levels before we hit that peak level of peak intensity of overwhelm, of meltdown, where we do lose that rational control, where we can impact safety and welfare. As much as possible, we want to try to be proactive in avoiding those things, or scenarios, I should say. Do know that if 5 different points is too much, you can easily adapt this. You can go that traffic model route of green, yellow, red, go, slow down, stop. A couple of other examples of ways that I've used this and individualized it to different people. 5-point scale example, and obviously Legos were of interest. So I found Lego faces that kind of match somewhat here. So I did that. This is a manipulative 5-point scale. So rather than having to verbally use this, you can, the student can non-verbally, or the individual rather, just move this once again to communicate that self-awareness of how they feel like they are feeling internally. Very similar, but different from the 5-point scale is the zones of regulation. One thing that sets this apart from the 5-point scale is this blue zone, that idea that we also can be under-regulated rather than over-regulated. Sometimes when we are sad, sick, tired, bored, we have to do things differently than if we are mad, we are anxious, we are out of control, etc. This is much more restrictive in the sense of having to pay to use. The 5-point scale is much more easily accessible without being behind a ton of expense and paywall. The last visual I want to share here is the relationship circles. This can be very useful for teaching and building skills related to interpersonal boundaries, whether that is physical contact, that as the individual is comfortable and chooses to do so, there are people in your life that it's okay to give a hug or a quick kiss when you see them. Grandma, grandpa, mom, dad, and that's not a universal for every family or every individual to be comfortable doing so. But this is where we can tease apart, this is okay here with these people or in this setting. There are other reasons why we may not want to engage in different forms of physical contact if there is contact at all. This also helps to teach not only for the individual whom and how they should be contacting someone, but who is okay or definitely not okay to be having any form of contact with the individual. This also can be useful for getting into topics of teaching how to seek or give consent for different forms of physical contact. It is also useful for information sharing, especially in the digital age. Who we give our address, our phone number, our social security number. We want to be very clear and explicit in order to keep people safe and free from different forms of victimization. This can also be helpful for knowing what topics may be expected or unexpected for different settings or individuals. For some individuals, they're very quick upon meeting someone, even for the first time, to potentially divulge very personal, private topics or information or challenges or experiences. Once again, this is how we can give that sort of feedback and skill building, but in any way that is very conducive to the thinking and learning styles of many individuals. And as we wrap up here to move into closing with questions, let's think about those strategies for how to respond rather than react when we do find ourselves in different high-level situations. So we are moving beyond those quote unquote green zones. And do know, I want to be very explicit in saying any sort of tool or resource or strategy or routine that you want to be able to fall back on at this point, you need to put in place, you need to prepare, you need to practice when we're down at that relative baseline level. That can seem a bit counterintuitive. Why do we need to practice taking a break when we don't need one? Because in a time of distress, those capacities are going to be likely reduced. And like any of us, when we are stressed out, we fall back on routine and habit. If you are trying to start a diet and you have a really rough day at work, you likely are not going to go home and follow through with that diet. Same sort of mentality. Let's prepare so that upon encountering these things, we have this at our disposal. And if it's not there, we need to work through it. And as I said, it's a cyclical process of planning, preparation, responding, and debriefing. General calming strategies. So this is not in that that peak escalation or meltdown, this is when things are starting to go in that direction that we are trying to recover from. It's often advantageous to reduce sensory input as we can. So maybe dimming the lights, lowering the sound, depending on where you find yourself, that may or may not be possible. We also can do so by removing or limiting the number of people in the vicinity or the people interacting. I love how Kaylie mentioned how they had one person as the point person interacting. That's not that you can't have support or someone to tap out with, but it doesn't do any good to have all of us standing around talking at this individual who is likely in a distressed sort of state. As distress and escalation increases, we want to go the opposite direction with our language, especially verbal language. We want to reduce or even eliminate. We want to move towards very simple directives, often delivered in a nonverbal sort of manner. We want to limit touch. If there is some reason that you need to do so, give advance notice. If possible, seek consent. We all can acknowledge that if anyone is about to run into oncoming traffic, there are potentially scenarios we could think of where you have to do what you have to do to keep someone safe. That's not what this is referring to. This is referring to where that is not critical in order to saving someone's life. If we need to go hands-on or touch, even to administer care, let's make sure that we are seeking consent or at least giving notice so that they can anticipate that that is going to occur. We all have a personal space bubble. As we move up that anxiety curve, that widens. Also, we talked about the benefit for many individuals that by allowing that movement and especially the ability to engage in stimming behaviors can serve a very functional purpose to recover, especially if someone is overwhelmed. And Kaylie mentioned having a designated place to go and take a break, to regulate, to have a safe spot. That's very easy when you're in somewhere where you're used to, like at home. It doesn't hurt, even if you're out in the community going somewhere, before you go about walking around the museum, you could find a nice quiet corner with a bench, maybe a water fountain, and say, if we do start to feel overwhelmed, and hopefully we catch that before that peak, this is where we are going to plan to go to take a break, to do what we need to do. That's also a way how, rather than waiting until that moment it's needed, let's think ahead. If something were to occur, what are we going to do to respond? Another thing I want to share, and I do know we're reaching the end of our time, so I'll be wrapping up in just a moment, and we can take questions that you may have. This is a method that was developed by someone named Deborah Lipsky. She is an autistic first responder, but this is an acronym and a step-by-step model to follow when we are working through meltdowns or that feeling of overwhelm. And so no matter where you are, at home, anywhere else, the first key is to either move to or create that safe space. So if we've already designated it, that's one thing that might make it slightly easier. If we aren't able to, if it's not realistic for that individual to move, then we need to accommodate the space around them to ensure their safety, the safety of others, as well as that individual's right to privacy and dignity. The C stands for calm, giving those simple directions in a very calm manner, as we mentioned, with the anxiety curve, using affirmations, either what to do or supportive statements of, you can work through this. Let's try to stay in the positive and affirmative. If someone does have a strategy or a routine rather of strategies that they use to recover from this sort of situation, remind or encourage them to fall back on that planning and provide empathy from that trauma-informed approach. Focus on what has happened to you, not what is wrong with you. That's the general mindset we want to try to keep ourselves in. And if we haven't already, we want to develop or fall back on different safety plans. Do know that if you do have to contact emergency services, you are able to also text to 911 as opposed to call. So that is, if that is more conducive to the situation or your ability to communicate, if you put 911 in the to part, you are able to use that as a way to access emergency services. Another thing to know is that in your phone, if you save something under the acronym ICE, that stands for in case of emergency. First responders are also trained, or that's a bit of a standardized mechanism. If you were for some reason incapacitated or need to direct someone to seek it out, obviously if your phone or device is locked, that won't allow them to access it. Also, as already mentioned, I'm not saying this is what you should do. I'm letting you know what options are available should you choose to use them. And finally, different community resources, but as we acknowledged at the start, depending on where you live, that impacts what's available to you. Many counties do have crisis response teams, and NAMI, Minnesota has a nice resource if you follow this link to see what's available. If you are interested in potentially trying to seek different forms of waivered services, your starting point would be to request a min choices assessment, and also consider different forms of respite opportunities for yourself as a parent, whether that does come about through formal waiver services or by leveraging family informal contacts that you have with friends to make sure that you have what you need as a care provider to adequately support your child or individual. You'll get a copy rather of the handout. All of these links are contained, many related to emergency preparedness. Also, I want to point out, here's that NARE report, as well as that article I'd highly recommend from the website Thinking Autism Guide. And the topic centers around aggression and self-injury, but from a standpoint that that was a bit, I wouldn't say new, but a refreshing sort of mindset on those sort of things. So Jamie, sorry for putting us right up against the time frame here, but I can stick around if individuals have questions that they want to ask in the chat or verbally. I also am happy to put my direct email in the chat, so that if you'd rather reach out that way, you are more than welcome to do so. But with that, Jamie, I'll toss it back to you as we wrap up.
No worries, Eric. I really appreciate your presentation today, and Kaylie, your storytelling. For the sake of the recording, and then just to share, because I know some people have been reading the chat, I wanted to point out that when you were on your Americans with Disability Act slide, that we had a participant mention that there's also a right to equal protection, which people with disabilities are often deprived of. I encourage people to go ahead and chat questions, but then I will be quiet in just a second and let anyone unmute as well. But then also when we were talking about the potential emergency cards and tokens, and Eric, to your point, you said these are just options, they don't work for everyone. But we did have a participant who wanted to, and I'll use her words exactly, I want to emphatically remind people that tokens and cards are very dangerous for people to carry, particularly people of color and people who are non-speaking. They may not comply, and they may reach for tokens and cards, which can result in police violence. These could be deadly. So that's obviously one of those situations where that is not only not a good fit, but actually would have the opposite effect. And I just wanted to say that out for our recording, since the chat isn't on there. With that, I will open it up for people to either raise their hands or unmute.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. I completely agree with those thoughts and statements that were shared. There's, like most things, there's benefits. There are also potentially drawbacks, and more so than that, there is potential harm or danger that can potentially be caused by those things. So that's by no means irrelevant. That's something that needs to be be put in the front of those considerations, discussions, choices. Once again, these are options that are available. It's on the family, the individual, to choose whether or not to use them.
I like to get comfortable with these awkward silences just so we can encourage people to participate as they're interested. So Eric has put his email in the chat, but I will also CC him when I send out our PDF of slides and our recording. Kaylie, I wanted to see if you had anything you wanted to add before we wrap up, and of course anyone else can jump in.
The only thing I think we maybe touched on very briefly, but just debriefing with our individuals who are encountering these things. It's important for us as caregivers just to make sure that we're doing everything we can, what went well, what could go better, but it's also a very traumatic experience for our kiddos or for the person that you care about who has had to go through this experience. If they're going through a meltdown or an emergency of any type, that is a highly emotionally charged and traumatic experience. So I think that there's debriefing to be done with them as far as, hey, what did I do well to help support you here? And what could I have done better? But then also an ongoing conversation of, you know, making sure the therapist or whoever is involved with them is aware of what has happened so that they have multiple facets to communicate about what their experience was, what was scary, what was hard, what went well, and help them kind of debrief on their own to whatever they might be experiencing emotionally after that experience.
That's a really great point, Kaylie. So in the chat, there's been a request in future sessions to hear more about when people with disabilities need assistance from emergency services, not just when they are perceived as the problem, but when they're the victim. And they point out that 90% of autistic girls will experience sexual assault in their life, but there is very little information about supporting them, and that non-speaking autistics are almost never allowed to even file reports when they are sexually assaulted. I know that I personally have a lot of concerns having a daughter with a disability around her vulnerability, so I appreciate you bringing that up. And then we have another comment mentioning that the state of Minnesota now has an option to add autism and mental health indicators to IDs, and that it is also an option to add emergency contact information. Thank you for adding your input, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely, Jamie. And I'm aware of those statistics as well. And on that relationship circle slide, part of the reason why I pointed out that point of not only, you know, thinking of it from that angle of the individual making contact with someone else, but also them understanding so that they can report it. Because if they aren't aware of those sort of things, you know, how do we give someone the tools to communicate when those things are happening? I'd love to build on this session in the future and get to things like that. I'd much, you know, rather than just adding it as a bullet point or a not a gloss over, but I'd rather give it the attention it deserves to dedicate, you know, a whole session towards that, than just trying to sneak it into the wider discussion. So I would consider this a great starting point, but by no means the end all be all or the only information that's needed and the resources that are available. So I appreciate everyone sharing their thoughts as well to pass along things and considerations that also are applicable to the audience here.
Mm-hmm.
I did have one question here, Jamie, about if I followed up or debriefed with the first responders, and I want to address that real quick. That I did follow up with the law enforcement officers to thank them, actually, because we had such a positive experience, and I feel like they probably only hear about negative experiences. The people I did not follow up with that I wish I would have is the paramedics. I feel like there was a lot missing in that encounter and a lot to be learned in that encounter. And so it's something that I would like to do in the future, to circle back around and follow up with them. Hey, this was, this is where this could have gone better. But I did try to reach out to the ones that I had names and contact information for.
Thank you. That's a great idea. And I think for the positive feedback, but also for any type of tips and tools for how they can improve. Well, I know we are over our time, but I appreciate all of our participants joining us. And again, our presenters, Kaylie and Eric, for all of your preparation. I know that you guys put a lot of heart into this, and I will again send out an email with a recording and a PDF of the slides so that you can follow the links if you're interested, and as well as our survey, just looking for some short feedback on how we can improve and what other topics we can cover. I've taken notes from the ones that came up in the chat.
Thank you again to both Family Voices and for everyone for attending and watching the session.
Thank you all. Take care.